All right, Daniel, very excited to speak with you today. Very excited to learn about your journey. Thanks so much for joining us. How you doing?
I'm doing really well. How are you, Ryan?
I'm well. I'm well. I'm very excited to talk to you. It's always exciting getting to speak with founders and CEOs of successful companies. And really where I want to start is knowing what you know today. I'm interested in what type of advice you would give to a founder that is producing a new product, right? One of the most difficult aspects is really creating an engaging product. Is there anything up front that you think would be beneficial in sharing with other folks in the space?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot in that question. I think you're talking about like the infant stage of a company trying to build something. I think that there's a lot of possibilities and ways that a person can tackle a problem. And there's different areas that people may want to go after. So in a broad sense, like you want to pick your market, what you're looking at. And that could be insurance companies, right? So say you want to create a product that you want to sell to an insurance company. That could be a product that you want to sell to medical devices, or you want to build software for physicians in surgery, doing surgeries, or you want to do something else. So once you decide on the market that you want to go after, I think there's different timelines. Specifically for hardware is a much harder journey, I think, than for software. In the sense that if you're building, say, a device that will track heartbeat, or a device that will track blood pressure, or a device that will track eye movement and, give you some indication of like what's wrong with your eye. I think all of those are different paths where you may actually have a longer journey. So you have to be mentally prepared for the length of the journey. Software tends to be a shorter journey because you know quickly whether something might work or not. If you're building hardware, I've seen a lot of people just take a while. At the end of the day, like where things get a little dicey and dangerous is when you don't have a user and you haven't launched the product. The longer that period is, the more risky the startup is, right? Because like you may not have any funding, you may have funding, but you only have so much like time that you're willing to tolerate without funding or without users. So it's a long-winded way of saying you probably need to get to at least one user in the shortest period of time possible. I spoke to several founders this last week, and I asked this question: do you have any users? When they say no, it's not a bad sign. It's just, are they focusing on getting that actual user to use the product? And if a person doesn't have a user, it tells me they need to focus on that. They need to print out like a piece of paper that says, get to first user. That's honestly like the end goal. Because if you want to build like a product that tracks or does like a variation of like a stent, right? Like a stent going in or a catheter or something going into the body, you have to get that approved. There's a whole approval process from the government. There's regulations. That's going to slow you down. But how do you get to that first user as fast as possible? And the same thing goes for software. How do you get to that first user? I don't think it's as obvious as possible because I see a lot of founders struggle. Last week, I probably spoke to 4 founders and I asked them, do you have any users? And they said no. So like, why aren't they focusing on that? Why aren't they having those conversations with those users? And that could be a doctor. It could be, it could be whatever they want. This applies more to generically, not just healthcare, but get that first user and, continually check in on that first user and see how they are relating to the product. Are they using the product? What's wrong with the product? And of course, it's not going to be perfect. You're going to have to just keep iterating and iterating. And once you have a user, you can get 2 users, you can get 4 users, you can get 8 users, you can get 16 users. And I think that's the journey that like a lot of people just say, I need this perfect product. I need this beautiful device that's going to do what I want it to do. And it's going to do it so well. But that's all in the founder's head.
Right.
The reality is that what people want, right? So the moment it's in the user's hands, you're going to get enormous amounts of feedback really fast in huge amounts of it. And if you don't iterate on that, I've seen founders struggle where they kind of force this product onto someone and the customer doesn't want it. The user doesn't want it. I can try to convince you to buy a widget from me, Ryan. Mm-hmm. I can say, take this widget and you may not want it. In my head, I think it's this perfect product for you. But the reality is you're like, it's just a useless widget. I'm just going to put it over here and maybe I'll shut Daniel up and I'll buy it. And then you just kind of put it to the side and never use it. like following up with consistency is so critical to like the lifeblood of a company. I mean, I'll give you an example outside of healthcare. Airbnb. I mean, a lot of people know the story of Airbnb. I love that company. I love the founders, but Paul Graham, the founder of Y Combinator, told the founders of Airbnb, you need to go see your users. Whoever is buying your product, which in their case, it's renting space in a home. They wanted to see why were people doing that and why were these the renters allowing this to happen. And they had candid conversations. They started staying in the Airbnbs. They started taking pictures of the Airbnbs, and they were so close to the product that they saw all the problems with what they created. They were able to like refine those very quickly to sustain themselves. And their journey was a hard journey. That's where their inflection point was, where they just started to really like hone in on the users and understand like the pain points there. Anyway, so that was a long-winded.
No, that's great. I appreciate it. I appreciate the breadth of the answer. Couple follow-up questions. You mentioned you've spoken to a few founders this week. I'm interested in a few common reasons you encounter for founders not having users, and what recommendations you would make for them to start that journey and to user acquisition.
I think founders get a lot of feedback, and this is just like the reality. There's all different reasons why a founder may not get that first user. All different reasons. One is, I spoke to one founder a few months ago, and the founder said, I don't want to launch because I don't want to embarrass myself, right? They need the perfect product. In their head, they're looking for this perfect product. Their product wasn't going to hurt anyone. It was more of a consumer app. It was lightweight. It was fun. I just told them, like, what are you going to lose by getting that feedback? Like, there's nothing to lose. Launch, right? I mean, that's one case where it was the founder holding himself back from like launching their product. Another case is like feedback from investors. So, another founder I spoke to, an investor said, you're not focusing on the right thing, right? You're not focusing where I want you to focus. And the investor was not an investor in this founder's company. Founder put this investor on this pedestal who didn't invest in their company. So in the founder's head, like, why would I even try to launch the product? Right. And I saw the product and I was like, people will use it. I saw it immediately and I'm like, this is something people would use. Get the feedback in immediately and don't worry about the revenue. Like for this one particular case where this founder was building this product, I really was like, don't focus on the revenue, because if you get those users, you can figure that out as you go, refine quickly. Why doesn't a company launch? I mean, some of them don't launch for like valid reasons because they're trying to refine something and they're not quite sure it's sellable yet. So like they're trying, but when you get into this, I'd call it like this fear mindset that it's not perfect. Like no product is perfect. I mean, you could look at the iPhone, right? It's this version is better than the last version. The next version is going to be better than this version. Like if Apple had that mindset, it needs to be perfect today. Like they would never release like the product themselves. And I think, they perfected it at this point in time today for today, but there's always a better version that they can always make. So I think just getting your mindset into like, get that user, because then that creates growth, that creates a feedback loop, that creates like a reality where you actually have like value and you're adding value and you're making something that the user wants. And, learning how they log in, when they log in, why do they log in, like all that is critical for like the lifeblood of a company. And I think, I think that's such an important piece to like at the starting phase of a company. And for me, I mean, honestly speaking, I think arrogance can create failure. And I think like in my journey as an entrepreneur, I was humble enough to say, I need to talk to users on a weekly basis, on a monthly basis, the users, because they create the real value for everyone that's involved, the employees I'm working with, the other people I'm working with, the investors. You need to get those feedback loops like going, and you need to talk consistently to users about or else you look at companies that were amazing and then they just like really arrogant and they just kind of disappear. Like it's a good example, Kodak, the film company, they were on top of the world. Like these camera companies were on top of the world. Everyone was buying film for their cameras. Everyone was, printing these beautiful pictures out. Why did these companies not focus on like the digital side of it and create like, maybe they didn't have to strive for a phone, but they could have strived for a better camera with digital images, as opposed to like focus on the existing products and saying, hey, we're generating all this money from all of this film created. Let's just stick with what we know, be hungry, always be like asking the questions, like, what does the user actually want? What's like the simplest common denominator for them to like use your product? You're sure you can get like a really beautiful camera and use that camera and print out film. But at the end of the day, people didn't really want that. They wanted like the ease of just taking a photo on maybe not the best resolution camera and like just emailing it to their friends or texting it to their friends or posting it on a social network. Why did a company like that fail, right? And you could look at that whether it's a big company or small company, and there's a dynamic. There was a company I love called WorkRamp. WorkRamp's awesome company. Founder, whenever I asked them to do something, I was a user. They would refine the product as fast as possible to make that happen. Can you do that at the larger stages, like at a company like generating $500 million? Maybe not. But when you have $10,000 a month in revenue, you should probably listen to like individual users and the requests, if that makes sense. So it gets harder at the larger scales, but you can do it. You just have to figure out how to do it well. Like, why are companies that are so successful today that are kind of on a tear? Why are they so successful? Is it the feedback loops that they're actually like iterating? And every large company at some point will fail. I hate to say it, like if you look at every large company out there, maybe it takes 100 years, maybe it takes 1,000 years. If they're not consistently looking at how to create that longevity, it becomes a problem. So like going back to your original question, founders tend to fail when they don't launch a product. If you can't launch it and you're a perfectionist to a point where it hinders the product release cycles, it is not going to create a successful like venture for you. So launching and taking feedback very quickly and iterating on that feedback, creating that trust is probably the best thing, I think in the early days. I never think about revenue for companies in the early days. Sure, it's great, but like you want the users to use the product versus the revenue when you have nothing, no users and nobody's using it. So like it's an idea in your head that you're applying and you're trying to think if someone can use it. But
fully agree with what you're saying there. And I think it's great for the listeners to hear as well. You mentioned, investors got brought up a few times during that last response. And I'd love to get your opinion on raising capital. It's a system that has transformed over the last few years. And I'm interested in your opinion, how the process has changed and how your fundraising approach may have shifted over the years to where you are today.
I mean, when building a company, I think a lot of it is not quite, most companies are not a Facebook, like a force that's to be reckoned with. Or, Facebook kind of came out of nowhere and it grew like a rocket ship. A lot of luck is involved. And I don't think a lot of people realize that there's a lot of luck involved with starting a company. So like when you building, if you have enough, like I would call it grit or fortitude. If you have grit and fortitude and you apply luck, you're doing something long enough where there are these moments, light at the end of the tunnel. So I think investors play into that. So say a company starts at this downturn, the market is really bad, people are scared. A lot of things are horribly happening in the world, like in Ukraine, and all of these forces are against like the creation of a company. Fundraising tends to happen to companies that have like good growth in users or in revenue. Say you take this grit and this fortitude and you apply luck and time and creating that feedback loop with users. If you do that enough with the length of time, I think that your chances of funding go up. And getting that feedback loop and getting users, getting growth, growing revenue or users, you tend to have a better chance over time. Now, in dark times like today, things are just bad. I think there are opportunities, and that is where a lot of great companies are started. So you get these mass layoffs at big companies, right? Like Fortune 500 companies doing these mass layoffs. You have startups doing these mass layoffs right now. Opportunistically, a company today has more of a chance of getting really good talent versus funding. So there's levers in the world for a startup. One of the levers that's really like available, you guys can compete very well with other companies because the layoffs are happening. People are scared and they want like a good company that's not going to just let them go, or they want to create their own job. And this applies to any startup. So like Dr. Chrono in the early days, we were created during a downturn exactly like this. And we were able to hire some of the earlier employees that were believers because they wanted to create their own jobs. They were like, I just lost my job. I don't know what to do. I need help. That magic of people wanting to work with you, it's great. People are willing to, take more bets on equity. People are willing to take like less salary. They're not looking to have like their laundry done or, a bus drive them to work or, what can you give me that this other company, it sounds silly, but like this company has cookies and, a fridge full of soda. Now you don't have a lot of that like competition for like really high markup, like silly services. Like this, this startup has a massage team come in once a week. Right. You guys are not that, you're not doing that. You don't have those conversations. Now it's, I need to create something for myself. I was just laid off and I don't know what to do. So like the levers for investors, maybe not as strong right now, meaning like investors might be a little cautious. The market's, slightly, it's not as strong as it once was, but hiring is like a huge lever that you guys and all startups have, whether it's a 1-person startup, a 5-person startup, a 10-person startup, 100-person startup, 1,000-person startup, like all of those levers to hire. People can hire right now because there's a lot of just layoffs happening in the United States and across the globe. Getting funding, it is possible, but you could do more with less, if that makes sense. So you can raise less money and hire for less, base salary and comp. The people are willing to do that because they want to believe in a startup and something that's going to be more secure than wherever they were before, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that luck applies, that luck over time, if you have the grit, the fortitude, and length of time and luck, things happen. Like there'll be like something that comes out for a startup. There'll be, every startup is built on like other past technologies, right? Like AWS came along that made like cloud services for startups to, build their product on easier, things like Python, Django, React, Ruby, very quick. And they have these like quick ways to build startups. That's layered on top of AWS. And then you have fast prototyping with 3D printers. Like all of this stuff is like the future startups are built on the past hard work of all these other entrepreneurs. So that means that you may not need as much funding. Like in the past, in like the 90s, people would have to raise money just to like get servers, like physical machines that they'd have to put into these like, huge data centers, and then they raise God knows how much money to just get the physical servers, the actual physical machine to put in so that they could run their servers. Now you can do it with you can do so much more with less. So fundraising and the process of fundraising, there's different ways to do that. I think it depends on the entrepreneur and it depends on like the mindset that they're in. Some founders like to fundraise in like a fundraising mode or non-fundraising mode.
Right.
We're going for our other, entrepreneurs, find an investor that they love. You have to be networking. Like you have to be networking for that. And then you're like, this is the perfect investor. I want to bring them in. And then you take their money. I think fundraising is also critical in the sense that you want to get people that are really on the like board with the vision of your company. You don't want to get investors that are, I would just say, misaligned in the sense like, maybe you get an investor in who wants to exit in 6 months, right? And you want to go a 10-year journey, but this investor's like, well, I want my money back in 6 months. Immediately you're creating a misalignment and a friction point for you and your like investors. So you don't want to do that candidly. So you have to have those conversations and say like, we envision ourselves going, 10 years and then doing this, or we envision ourselves going 7 years and then this, or we envision ourselves doing this in 3 years. If the investor doesn't like hearing that, they're not the right investor and you shouldn't take their money. So like that you have to say no even, and that's hard. You know that the investor is not the right fit. You have to say no because they're just not going to be happy with the outcome that you're trying to strive for as a founder.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's great. It's a great response. I really like the idea of fortitude being a part of luck. I had a mentor tell me once that luck is hard work and the right time coming together simultaneously. So I think it's how you outlined it was great. Any advice to ensure that founders are aligned with their investors? Questions you would ask or conversations you would have to make sure that this partnership is going to be a long and healthy one?
I think it depends on the investor, and it depends on the situation. So you can give, I've seen founders do all different sorts of things. Like some founders will send a monthly report, and in that monthly report, it'll say like, here's our, user growth, here's our revenue growth. That's a really great way to. That's a great way to like just keep everyone involved, like in the loop. Others, they may want to have a monthly board meeting. This all depends on stage. Like in the early days when you're one entrepreneur and you may have one investor, do you need that monthly check-in? Maybe not. It depends on how much the investors put in and how comfortable they are. So I think setting the stage, the way that you and the investor, there's no wrong or right answer to this. It's setting the stage, like what you feel comfortable with as an entrepreneur, and then also what the investor feels comfortable with as the investor. And then you could kind of work with them and make it work. Monthly check-ins, quarterly check-ins, yearly check-ins, maybe a check-in every 2 years. It depends on the investor, honestly. Sometimes some investors, they're fine with like not hearing anything at all. But I've seen founders send out these monthly reports. Others have quarterly big, beautiful decks, and they'll send those out and they'll show a bunch of information. So it really depends. I think where it could hurt the entrepreneur is if there's too much that investors are asking for to the point where they're not focusing on the company, but they're focusing on information, like if you spend 2 weeks every month creating like beautiful decks for investors that are existing investors, is that the best use of your time? Bring that up to the investor and say, hey, I'm spending, so much time on this. Is there a way for us to optimize this? Can I just give you a spreadsheet or something? I don't know. It really depends.
The reason we've been diving into all these investment conversations and advice you would give current founders stems from the successful experience you've had in the past.
Every take on a product is different. Like all the EV companies out there, right? So you take like a Hummer, which is a EV car, beautiful truck. Then you take the Tesla, you take the Rivian. They're so different. Everybody's take is different. So people really pick and choose like what they want, right? Some people want the Tesla for the self-driving. Other people want a Rivian because it has a bed and they can put lots of stuff in there. I don't think there's a lot of people say it's a winner take all market. Like there can only be one, or, they'll say, healthcare is going to consolidate into one. It's kind of irrational thinking because there's Pepsi, there's Coke. Why isn't Pepsi dead because Coke is there? Like, I don't think people realize like people like choice and whether, people like options in life. And I think that's where you're never going to get an only one winner. I think a lot of people have this binary. We're going to take the whole market.
So my next question, I was going to dive into your product management philosophy. And I feel like we've caught some of them throughout, right? Customer feedback sounds like it's very important to you. Options, right? Understanding that there's going to be a competitive landscape and that your offering needs to be comparable to others, so consumers have a plethora of options. Do you have a particular product management philosophy for delivering value to your users and some of the chaos that can be associated with adding new features, based off requests from consumers or feedback you've collected?
I'd say the way that I normally work is, Ryan, what are your top 3 objectives for this week, right? And I would ask people this question, what are your top 3 objectives, right? And people would rattle off what their objectives are and say like, I need to hire 4 people, or I need to find one person that's good to work with for the company. Or maybe someone says, I want to build this feature. If you write that down someplace, chances of it happening tend to be a little bit higher in my mind, because you've written it down. There's so much chaos happening in a startup and in any job and in life and family. When you go back and revisit what you wrote down this week, you tend to realize this is my top priority. You're pulled in all these directions. If you wrote those 3 things down Sunday night or Monday morning and then revisited them the next week and look at them all and say, did I get any of these done? And if the answer is no, that's okay. Rewrite them down.
Right.
But if you go 5 weeks and you haven't done those 3 things, you're going to realize I'm not focusing on the right things because people are just pulling me in directions that are not important. And you want to think about like, what are those 3 things that are going to help you either improve or scale, like optimize the company or you and like yourself. And people would, put things down like, going to take a 2-day course, need to enroll in the 2-day course for whatever, product management. And if they didn't enroll in a 2-day course this week, that's okay. But at least they like reset it the next week where they go, oh, I forgot to do that because there's too much happening in my life. I need to focus on that this week. And then if they could get that done. So it's every day, like reflecting on those lists. And it could be simpler lists like talk to this person. It could be just that. That could be like your list. So I think people talk about these high level OKRs for like the month, the quarter, the year. I would always call it like a micro OKR. People hated that term. I don't know why people hate that term, but I call it a micro OKR where it's, you can only do so much in a week. If you can get those things done, it's a success. And then layering on top of that, like strategy of like listing those 3 things, when I was in person, I would have whiteboards everywhere, all over the office. I would make people write it down on a whiteboard. And, when you would come into the office every day, you'd see your OKRs and you'd see other people's micro OKRs.
Right.
You just look at them all and then you'd be like, those are mine. And then it would just create a transparency in a really nice way where people didn't even have to have meetings. And they'd be like, oh, this person's trying to make, that sale. I didn't even know that. And then, you look over there and you'd see like another micro OKR for someone. I don't think that the definition of OKR is what, it's intended. It's intended for like a bigger goal, but I think a micro OKR is more achievable in like a short term where you can just do something significant for yourself and then it helps the team. Or maybe it's just intrinsically just for yourself. Whiteboards are really important. It sounds really silly if you're in an in-person setting, and then micro OKRs are really a great way to just set your goals, but also like let other people see them. Like say, I'm going to set these and you guys can see them.
Yeah. I mean, that makes a lot of sense. Specifically, if you're working in like a, sprint environment, 2 to 3 week sprints where you're, accomplishing, mini goals each day or week leading up to a larger project. So I think the micro OKR makes a lot of sense.
If I throw a crazy idea at someone and they said it's done, it's like that creates like trust. And it's like this trust systems and people working together. I mean, that's how like I'll give you an example, like the iPhone. I'll go back to the iPhone.
Yeah.
Apple doesn't make all the parts on the iPhone. I don't know if you have all these other companies that working in tandem to really create the iPhone. Like this device, like this screen is from a company called Gorilla Glass. Right. Apple has enough trust in them because they're taking feedback from, a company like an Apple to like create an amazing product, and they iterate together in some way that works for them. Every journey it looks super easy on the outside. Like Facebook was, created and whatever, and the guy's super wealthy and I want to do that and it's easy. I think when you open up the curtains, I think that there's a lot of fortitude and, there's a lot of it's not as exciting as people want to think. I heard once someone say it's like watching the wall, the paint on the wall dry, because it doesn't like, it's sitting in a room, like hacking on a computer, or it's not as fun as people think it is.